Picture this. You're standing in the rain at your children's school, already running late from work, when your ex-husband's trophy wife decides to make you the target of her public entertainment. She mocks your appearance, your car, even suggests you've forgotten how to parent your own kids. The other mothers look away in embarrassment while she performs this cruel theater for everyone to witness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now imagine discovering that this woman, who's been tearing you down for months, is living a complete lie. That her perfect marriage, designer lifestyle, and condescending attitude are all built on a foundation of debt, deception, and desperation. What would you do with that information? This is the story of Diana Walsh, a single mother who discovered that sometimes the universe has its own way of serving justice. But the way she handled that revelation will surprise you, challenge you, and maybe even inspire you to reconsider what true strength really looks like. The autumn rain drummed against the windshield of my aging Toyota Camry as I pulled into the chaotic pickup lane at Meadowbrook Elementary. October in Portland meant unpredictable weather, and today had delivered a steady drizzle that made everything look gray and uninviting. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard and winced. 4 minutes late, which meant Ethan and Grace would be among the last children waiting under the covered walkway. My day at the nonprofit had run longer than expected. We'd been dealing with budget cuts that threatened our after-school tutoring program, and as the program coordinator, I'd spent the last hour in an emergency meeting trying to figure out how to serve twice as many kids with half the funding. The stress of it all had left me with a tension headache that pulsed behind my temples. I spotted the gleaming white Range Rover immediately. It was parked in the prime spot closest to the school entrance, and even through the rain-streaked windows, I could see the distinctive silhouette of Vanessa Chen, my ex-husband's new wife. Her perfectly styled black hair caught the light as she stood chatting with a cluster of other mothers, all of whom seemed to orbit around her like planets around the sun. 3 months. That's how long it had been since David had introduced Vanessa to the kids as his special friend. 3 months since my carefully constructed post-divorce routine had been disrupted by this woman who seemed determined to prove that she was everything I wasn't. Younger at 28 to my 35. Perfectly groomed where I was perpetually rushed. Financially comfortable where I counted every dollar twice. I parked 4 spaces back from the entrance and sat for a moment, steeling myself for whatever performance Vanessa had planned for today. There was always something. A comment about my work clothes. A suggestion that I should try a new hairstyle. Observations about my car or my shoes. Or the fact that I brought the kids their forgotten lunch in a plain brown bag, instead of an insulated designer lunchbox. The other mothers in her circle never said anything directly to me, but I caught their glances. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed entertained by the drama. A few avoided eye contact altogether, probably grateful that they weren't the target of Vanessa's particular brand of passive-aggressive entertainment. I grabbed my umbrella and stepped out into the drizzle, immediately feeling the October chill seep through my blazer. It was the same navy blue one I'd worn to work for the past 2 years, professional but showing signs of wear around the cuffs. I'd been meaning to replace it, but between the kids, school supplies, Ethan's soccer fees, and Grace's art classes, my wardrobe had become the lowest priority on a long list of expenses. As I approached the group of waiting parents, I could hear Vanessa's voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. She had one of those voices that seemed designed for projection, sweet on the surface but with an edge that could cut glass when she wanted it to. "Oh, look, here comes our favorite working mom," she announced with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Diana, honey, running a little behind again today?" The conversation among the other mothers died instantly. Mrs. Patterson from Grace's class looked down at her phone. Jennifer Martinez suddenly found the school's announcement board fascinating. Only Karen Webb, who'd been dealing with her own difficult divorce, met my eyes with a look of quiet solidarity. "Traffic was heavy downtown," I replied evenly, forcing my voice to stay calm and professional. I'd learned over the past months that reacting emotionally to Vanessa's comments only gave her more ammunition. "Downtown," Vanessa repeated, with a theatrical sigh. "That nonprofit job must be so fulfilling, even if it doesn't pay much. David was just telling me how admirable it is that you've chosen purpose over profit." The way she said it made charity work sound like a character flaw rather than a career choice. I felt my cheeks warm but kept my expression neutral. David and I had argued about money plenty during our marriage, but he'd never dismissed my work the way Vanessa was doing now. "The kids should be out any minute," I said, checking my watch and deliberately changing the subject. "Yes, they're probably wondering where you are," Vanessa continued, apparently not finished with her performance. "Grace asked me yesterday if I thought you worked too much." Such a perceptive little girl. I told her that some people just have different priorities. The comment hit like a physical blow. Grace had asked Vanessa about my work schedule? My 8-year-old daughter was discussing her concerns about me with her father's girlfriend? The implications made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to respond calmly. "Grace knows she can talk to me about anything that's bothering her." "Oh, I'm sure she does," Vanessa said with that same brittle smile. "But sometimes children feel more comfortable sharing their worries with someone who seems less stressed all the time. Less stressed." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Vanessa had never been a single parent juggling a full-time job, school schedules, household management, and the emotional aftermath of a divorce. She lived in David's beautifully renovated craftsman house in the hills, drove a car that cost more than I made in 6 months, and had the luxury of treating parenthood like a hobby rather than a 24/7 responsibility. "Mom!" Ethan's voice cut through the tension as he came running across the wet pavement, his backpack bouncing behind him. At 10 years old, he was all energy and enthusiasm, seemingly oblivious to the adult dynamics playing out around him. Grace followed more slowly, her artistic temperament making her naturally observant of social undercurrents. She hugged me tightly, and I felt some of the day's stress melt away. Whatever else was happening in my life, these 2 kids were thriving, and that was what mattered most. "How was school today?" I asked, genuinely interested in their answers. "We started our science project on ecosystems," Ethan said excitedly. "Can we go to the library this weekend to get books about rainforests?" "Absolutely. What about you, Gracie?" "We're learning about different art techniques. Mrs. Kim showed us how to do watercolors today." Grace's eyes lit up the way they always did when she talked about art. "Can I show you when we get home?" "I can't wait to see it." Vanessa had been listening to our exchange with that calculated smile still fixed on her face. "Oh, that reminds me," she said, addressing the children directly. "Your dad and I are planning something special for this weekend. We thought you might like to visit that new children's museum downtown, the one with the interactive exhibits." Ethan and Grace exchanged glances, clearly excited about the prospect but also uncertain about how to respond in front of me. "That sounds like fun," I said, meaning it. Whatever issues I had with Vanessa, I didn't want my children to feel caught in the middle. "You'll have to tell me all about it." "Actually," Vanessa continued, her voice taking on that false sweetness again, "we were thinking of making it a whole weekend thing. Maybe dinner at that new family restaurant with the arcade, then the museum on Saturday, and a movie on Sunday. David's been working so hard lately, and we thought the kids deserve some real quality time. Real quality time. As opposed to the apparently inferior time they spent with me, helping with grocery shopping and homework and chores." The implication was clear, and it stung more than I wanted to admit. "That sounds wonderful for them," I managed, though my voice came out slightly strained. The school doors opened, and more children began streaming out, creating a natural end to the conversation. As parents collected their kids and dispersed toward the parking lot, I felt the familiar relief that came with surviving another encounter with Vanessa. But as we walked to Rencar, Grace slipped her small hand into mine and squeezed gently. "Mom, are you okay? You look sad." I stopped walking and knelt down to meet her eyes. At 8, Grace had inherited my sensitivity and David's perceptiveness, a combination that made her remarkably attuned to emotional undercurrents. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Just thinking about work stuff. Sometimes grown-up jobs can be complicated." "Is it because of Vanessa?" Ethan asked bluntly. "She always talks to you weird." The fact that my 10-year-old had noticed Vanessa's behavior was both validating and concerning. I didn't want my children to feel responsible for defending me, But I also couldn't pretend that everything was perfectly fine. Sometimes adults don't get along as well as we'd like, I said carefully. But that's not your problem to worry about, okay? Your job is to be kids and let the adults handle adult things. But it is our problem if it makes you sad, Grace said with the earnest logic of childhood. I hugged both of them tightly, feeling a rush of love so intense it almost brought tears to my eyes. You two make me happy every single day. Don't ever forget that. As we drove home through the Portland drizzle, I listened to Ethan and Grace chatter about their day, their voices filling the car with the comfortable noise of family life. They talked about friends and teachers, about upcoming school events and weekend plans. Normal kid conversations that reminded me that despite everything else that was happening, I was doing something right. Our rental house came into view as we turned onto Maple Street, a modest 2-bedroom that I'd found 6 months after the divorce was finalized. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, with its small front yard and aging siding, but it was ours. The kids had helped me paint their shared bedroom a cheerful yellow, and we'd planted a small vegetable garden in the backyard that had actually produced tomatoes and lettuce over the summer.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Inside, the house was warm and lived in, with Grace's artwork covering the refrigerator and Ethan's soccer trophies lining the living room shelf. It was the kind of home where you could actually live, where spilled juice didn't cause a crisis and muddy shoes were just part of life. While the kids started their homework at the kitchen table, I began preparing dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti with meat sauce and a salad, but it was homemade and would stretch into lunches for the rest of the week. As I browned the ground beef, I found myself thinking about Vanessa's comments from earlier. The truth was, I did work a lot. My job at the Northwest Family Resource Center required long hours and emotional investment that often spilled over into evenings and weekends. But it was work that mattered, helping low-income families access educational resources and support services. Every grant I wrote, every program I coordinated, every family I connected with tutoring or counseling services, made a real difference in someone's life. The pay wasn't great, that much was true. I made about 40% of what David earned in his accounting firm, and without his income to supplement our household budget, money was always tight. But I'd chosen this work deliberately, both because I believed in it and because it offered the flexibility I needed as a single parent. Mom, can you help me with this math problem? Ethan called from the table. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and moved to look over his shoulder. 4th grade multiplication, presented in word problems that required more reading comprehension than mathematical skill. Let's work through it together, I said, settling into the chair next to him. What do you think the problem is asking you to find? As we worked through the problem step by step, Grace looked up from her own worksheet. Mom, why does Vanessa always say things that sound nice but feel mean? The question caught me off guard, both because of its perceptiveness and because I wasn't sure how to answer it honestly without disparaging David's girlfriend. Sometimes people say things in ways that aren't very kind, I said slowly. Usually it's because they're feeling insecure about something themselves. What's she insecure about? Quote, Ethan asked, genuinely curious. I paused, considering how to explain adult relationship dynamics to children who shouldn't have to understand them yet. I don't really know, I said finally, but when people feel like they need to make others look small, it's usually because they don't feel very big themselves. Grace nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 8-year-old worldview. After dinner, we settled into our evening routine. Baths, pajamas, and story time in Grace's room, where we took turns reading chapters from Charlotte's Web. It was a ritual we'd maintained since before the divorce, one of the constants that helped anchor our family life in the midst of all the changes. When the kids were finally asleep, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, reviewing budget projections for the tutoring program. The numbers weren't encouraging. Unless we could secure additional funding in the next quarter, we'd have to cut services just as the need was increasing. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Kids excited about museum trip this weekend. Thanks for being flexible with the schedule. I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decode whether there was any hidden meaning in his words. During our marriage, David had been straightforward to the point of bluntness, but the divorce had changed the way we communicated. Now every interaction felt carefully calculated, filtered through lawyers and custody agreements, and the invisible presence of his new girlfriend. "No problem," I typed back. "They're looking forward to it." It was true, but it was also incomplete. What I didn't say was that I was dreading the weekend alone, the empty house, the absence of their voices and laughter. What I didn't say was that I worried about what Vanessa might say to them about me when I wasn't there to provide context or counterbalance. What I didn't say was that some nights, after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, I questioned every decision I'd made since the divorce. Had I chosen my job over my family's financial security? Was I too proud to ask for help when I needed it? Was Vanessa right about my priorities being wrong? But sitting there in my small kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built for my children, I pushed those doubts aside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, probably including another encounter with Vanessa at school pickup. But tonight, Ethan and Grace were safe and loved and sleeping peacefully in their beds. And for now, that was enough. Outside, the Portland rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean and promising a fresh start with the morning. I closed my laptop, finished my wine, and went to check on the kids one more time before bed. Grace was curled up with her favorite stuffed elephant, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Ethan had kicked off his covers and was sprawled across his bed in the boneless way that only children can manage. They looked peaceful and secure, untroubled by adult complications. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, I would face them the same way I'd faced everything else since the divorce. One day at a time, with my children's well-being as my North Star, and my own integrity intact. The rain drummed against the windows as I turned off the lights and headed toward my own room, unaware that everything I thought I knew about Vanessa's perfect life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. The truth came to light 3 weeks later in the most unexpected way possible. I was having lunch with my colleague Sarah Martinez at the small cafe near our office, when she mentioned something that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. "Did you hear about that big foreclosure mess on Hillcrest Drive?" Sarah asked, scrolling through her phone while picking at her salad. "My neighbor works at the bank, and apparently one of those fancy houses is going into default. The owners haven't made a payment in 4 months. Hillcrest Drive. That was where David and Vanessa lived, in the beautiful craftsman house with the perfectly manicured lawn and the 3-car garage. The house that Vanessa had mentioned several times during her school pickup performances, always with subtle digs about how nice it was to have space for the children to spread out. "Which house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "The blue one with the white trim, I think. You know, the one that got featured in that home renovation magazine last year. Apparently the guy who owns it is some kind of accountant, but he's been making some really bad financial decisions." My heart started racing. David was an accountant, and their house had indeed been featured in Portland Home and Garden after they'd completed an expensive renovation project. But David was supposed to be financially stable. That had been one of the arguments during our divorce proceedings, his lawyer emphasizing his steady income and responsible money management. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" She looked up from her phone, noting the intensity in my voice. "Pretty sure. Why? Do you know them?" I hesitated, unsure how much I wanted to reveal about my personal situation. It might be my ex-husband's place. We share custody of 2 kids. Sarah's expression immediately shifted from casual gossip to genuine concern. "Oh, Diana, I'm sorry. I didn't realize. My neighbor mentioned it because she was worried about property values in the neighborhood." That afternoon, I couldn't concentrate on work. Every time I tried to focus on grant applications or program planning, my mind wandered back to Sarah's revelation. If David and Vanessa were truly facing foreclosure, what did that mean for the kids? For their stability and security during their time at their father's house? More troubling was the realization that if David was in serious financial trouble, the child support payments that helped cover Ethan and Grace's school expenses and extracurricular activities might be at risk. Those payments weren't large, but they were consistent, and I'd built my monthly budget around them. After work, instead of heading straight home, I found myself driving through David's neighborhood. I told myself I was just curious, that I needed to see for myself whether there was any truth to Sarah's information. But as I turned onto Hillcrest Drive, I knew I was looking for answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. The house looked the same from the outside. The lawn was still immaculate, the flower beds perfectly maintained. David's silver sedan was in the driveway, along with Vanessa's white Range Rover. Everything appeared normal, prosperous, exactly as it had always looked. But as I sat in my car across the street, trying to decide whether this reconnaissance mission made me pathetic or prudent, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small sign posted near the front door, barely visible from the street. I couldn't read it from this distance, but it was the right size and shape for a legal notice. My phone rang, startling me out of my surveillance. The caller ID showed my attorney's office. "Diana, this is Patricia Wells. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Patricia had handled my divorce proceedings and still managed the occasional legal issue related to custody or support. Her calls usually meant paperwork or minor schedule adjustments, nothing urgent. Of course, what's going on? I received a call from David's attorney this morning. They're requesting a modification to the custody agreement and the support arrangement. My stomach dropped. What kind of modification? They want to reduce David's support obligations and adjust the custody schedule to give him less time with the children during weekdays. Less time with the children and less financial support. The combination felt like confirmation of everything Sarah had told me about the foreclosure. Patricia, can they do that? Just decide they want to pay less and see the kids less? They can request it, but any modification has to be approved by the court and must be based on a significant change in circumstances. David's attorney mentioned some financial hardship, but they were vague about the details. Financial hardship. The euphemistic language lawyers used when someone's life was falling apart. What do I need to do? First, don't panic. These requests are more common than you'd think, especially when people's circumstances change. Second, I need you to document everything. Your current expenses for the children, their schedules, any changes you've noticed in David's behavior or living situation. Changes in David's behavior. Now that Patricia mentioned it, I realized there had been signs I'd dismissed or ignored. David had been less communicative lately, responding to my texts about the kids. Schedules with one-word answers instead of his usual detailed planning. He'd missed Ethan's last soccer game, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. And there had been a tension in his voice during our brief phone conversations that I'd attributed to adjustment stress with his new relationship. Patricia, what happens if he stops paying support entirely? Quote, then we take him back to court, and the state can garnish his wages or place liens on his property. But Diana, try not to borrow trouble. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. After I hung up, I sat in my car for another few minutes, watching David's house and trying to process everything I'd learned. The woman who had been systematically undermining my confidence for months, who had made me question my worth as a mother and a person, was apparently living in a house of cards that was beginning to collapse. The irony was almost overwhelming. Every snide comment about my car, my clothes, my job, my financial situation had been coming from someone whose own financial situation was apparently far more precarious than mine. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through downtown Portland. The city looked different somehow, as if the revelation about David and Vanessa had shifted my perspective on everything else. The small restaurants and shops that I'd always found charming now seemed like symbols of a simpler, more authentic way of living than the facade I'd been envying. When I got home, Ethan and Grace were at the kitchen table working on homework, supervised by Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher who watched them for a few hours each day after school. It was an arrangement that cost more than I could easily afford, but it gave me peace of mind, knowing they were safe and engaged in productive activities. How was everyone's day? I asked, kissing the tops of their heads and reviewing their progress on math worksheets and reading assignments. Good, Grace said without looking up from her art project. But Ethan got in trouble for talking during silent reading. I wasn't talking, Ethan protested. I was just asking Tommy if he knew what precipitation meant. During silent reading, buddy, questions wait until the end, I said gently. What did Mrs. Johnson say? Just that I need to raise my hand instead of whispering. But Mom, I was trying to help Tommy understand the story. This was classic Ethan, whose generous impulse to help others sometimes conflicted with classroom rules. I was proud of his desire to help his friend, but I also needed him to understand the importance of following his teacher's guidelines. "I appreciate that you want to help Tommy," I said, settling into a chair beside him. "But there are appropriate times and ways to help. During silent reading, the best way to help everyone is to read quietly so nobody gets distracted." Grace looked up from her artwork, a watercolor painting of what appeared to be our back garden. "Mom, are you and Daddy fighting about something?" The question caught me completely off guard. Grace was often perceptive about adult emotions, but I thought I'd been careful to keep my concerns about David's situation separate from my interactions with the children. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because you have that worried look you get sometimes, and Daddy seemed really stressed when he picked us up yesterday. Vanessa was being extra nice to us, like when adults are nice because they feel guilty about something." The sophistication of Grace's emotional intelligence never ceased to amaze me, but in this case, I wished she was less observant. 8-year-olds shouldn't have to analyze adult behavior for signs of instability. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated things to work out," I said carefully. "But that doesn't mean you need to worry about it. Your dad and I both love you and Ethan very much, and that's never going to change. Even if you're not married anymore. Even if we're not married anymore. Some things never change, and how much we love you is one of them." Ethan had been listening to this conversation while pretending to focus on his math worksheet. "Mom, is Daddy going to keep living in that big house with Vanessa?" I felt like I was navigating a minefield, trying to be honest with my children without revealing information that wasn't mine to share, or creating anxiety about things beyond their control. "I don't know what your dad's plans are for the future," I said truthfully. "But wherever he lives, you'll still spend time with him, and wherever we live, this will always be your home with me." That evening, after the kids were in bed, I found myself researching foreclosure procedures online. I told myself it was just information gathering, that I needed to understand what might be happening so I could prepare for potential changes in our custody arrangement or financial situation. What I learned was sobering. Foreclosure was a lengthy process, typically taking several months from the first missed payment to the actual loss of the property. If David and Vanessa were indeed facing foreclosure, they'd probably been dealing with financial problems for much longer than the missed payments would suggest. I also learned that foreclosure was often the visible symptom of deeper financial troubles. People facing foreclosure frequently had multiple debts in default, damaged credit, and limited options for finding new housing quickly. The more I read, the more concerned I became about the children's welfare during their time with David. If he was dealing with serious financial stress, if they were going to have to move suddenly, if Vanessa was as unaware of the situation as she appeared to be during her school pickup performances, then Ethan and Grace might be walking into an environment of adult chaos and instability. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Can we talk?" "About the kids, schedule for next month." I stared at the message for several minutes, wondering how much he planned to reveal and how much I should admit to knowing. The ethical part of me knew that his financial problems were his private business, that I shouldn't have been researching his situation online or driving by his house. But the practical part of me, the part responsible for protecting my children's emotional and physical well-being, felt justified in seeking information that might affect their safety and security. "Sure," I texted back, "when works for you?" "Tomorrow evening after I drop the kids off? Maybe we could grab coffee. Coffee with David." We hadn't sat down together for a casual conversation in over a year, not since the divorce papers were signed, and we'd settled into our carefully structured co-parenting routine. The suggestion felt both familiar and foreign, like returning to a house you used to live in. "Okay. The usual place at 7? See you then." I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of family life, and tried to prepare myself for whatever revelation David was planning to share. The house felt especially peaceful that night, with the kids sleeping soundly in their beds and the Portland rain creating a gentle soundtrack against the windows. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, whatever changes were coming to our carefully constructed routine, I would handle them the same way I'd handled everything else since the divorce. One conversation at a time, with my children's best interests as the guiding principle, and my own integrity intact. But as I finally headed to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa's cruel comments at school pickup were about to be revealed as the desperate performance of someone whose own life was much more fragile than she'd ever let anyone see. The next evening arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. David had picked up the kids for their regular Wednesday evening, returning them at 6:30 with homework completed and stories about dinner at a new pizza place downtown. "Thanks for handling the homework," I told him as Ethan and Grace headed inside to get ready for baths. "No problem. They're good kids." There was something different about his demeanor, a heaviness that hadn't been there during our usual brief handoffs. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than simple fatigue, and his clothes, while still professional, seemed less carefully maintained than usual. "I'll see you at 7, I said, and he nodded before walking back to his car. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from David at the small cafe where we'd had our first date 15 years earlier. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me, but it was also the most neutral ground we could find. A place with enough history to feel comfortable but not so much emotional weight that it would interfere with whatever conversation we needed to have. David ordered black coffee, which was unusual. During our marriage, he'd always added cream and sugar, joking that he needed all the help he could get to function in the morning. I ordered my usual latte and waited for him to begin. "Diana, I need to tell you some things that are going to affect the kids' schedule and our arrangement." I nodded, trying to appear calm and receptive while my heart rate increased. "I'm having some financial difficulties. Some investments that didn't work out the way I expected, and some decisions that looked good at the time but turned out to be mistakes." Investments. I remembered David talking during our marriage about wanting to diversify beyond his accounting practice, about opportunities in real estate or stock trading that could provide additional income. I'd always been more conservative about money, preferring the security of steady employment to the potential rewards of riskier ventures. "What kind of difficulties?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from our most stressful conversations during the marriage. "The house is in foreclosure. We have to be out by the end of next month." The confirmation of what I'd already suspected still felt like a physical blow. "David, how did this happen?" A lot of small bad decisions that added up to one big mess. I borrowed against the house to invest in some property development deals that fell through. Then I used credit cards to cover the mortgage payments when my business income dropped. Then the credit cards were maxed out, and I took out a second mortgage to pay them off. It was a classic spiral of debt that I'd seen described in financial advice articles, but had never imagined affecting someone I knew. Certainly not David, who'd always been meticulous about balancing checkbooks and paying bills on time. "Where will you and Vanessa go?" "That's part of what I need to talk to you about. Vanessa and I are separating. She's moving back in with her parents temporarily, and I'm going to rent a small apartment downtown. 1 bedroom, so I won't be able to have the kids overnight for a while." I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that my children wouldn't be caught in the middle of David and Vanessa's relationship drama, concern about the practical implications of modified custody arrangements, and something that might have been satisfaction that Vanessa's perfect life had turned out to be an illusion. "How long is a while?" "I don't know yet. I need to get my finances stabilized, find a bigger place, prove to the court that I can provide appropriate housing for them. It could be 6 months, could be longer. 6 months or longer of having Ethan and Grace full-time, of being their only stable parent while David rebuilt his life." The responsibility felt overwhelming and reassuring at the same time. "David, what about child support?" He looked down at his coffee cup, clearly dreading this part of the conversation. "I'm going to have to request a reduction. Temporary, I hope, but I can't maintain the current payments while I'm trying to dig out of this hole." A reduction in child support while taking on full-time parenting responsibilities. The math didn't work in my favor, but I also understood that there was no point in demanding payments from someone who genuinely couldn't make them. "How much of a reduction?" "Maybe half for now. I know that puts more pressure on you, and I'm sorry. I never intended for things to get this complicated." Half of his already modest support payments would mean cutting something from our monthly budget, maybe Ethan's soccer league, or Grace's art classes, or the after-school care that allowed me to work full-time. "Diana, there's something else you should know about Vanessa and how she's been treating you." I looked up from my own coffee, surprised by the shift in topic. I should have said something sooner, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until this week. The financial stress has been affecting both of us, and Vanessa has been taking it out on you in ways that aren't fair or appropriate. This was the closest David had ever come to acknowledging Vanessa's behavior at school pickup and other public encounters. She told me that she's been making comments about your job and your financial situation, about your parenting choices. She said it was just friendly teasing, but I've started to realize it was more than that. Friendly teasing, the same euphemistic language that adults use to dismiss bullying when children did it to each other. Why didn't you say anything before? David was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cafe window at the early evening foot traffic on the sidewalk. Because I was ashamed of the financial mess, of the fact that someone I was with was treating you badly, of the whole situation, and because part of me was angry at you for seeming to have everything figured out when my life was falling apart. The honesty of his admission surprised me. During our marriage and divorce, David had rarely been willing to acknowledge his own emotional reactions, preferring to focus on practical solutions and logical arguments. I don't have everything figured out, I said softly. I've been struggling too, just differently. I know, and I'm sorry it took me this long to see that. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, processing the weight of everything we'd shared. Outside, Portland was settling into its evening rhythm. People heading home from work or out for dinner, living their normal lives while ours underwent another fundamental shift. What do we tell the kids? This was the question I'd been dreading, but also the most important one. Ethan and Grace had already been through the trauma of divorce, and now they'd have to adjust to another major change in their family structure. The truth, but in an age-appropriate way, David said, that I need to move to a different house for a while, that they'll be staying with you most of the time until I get settled, that none of this changes how much I love them. And Vanessa? They should probably know that she won't be living with me anymore, but I don't think they need the details of why we separated. I nodded, grateful that David was thinking about the children's emotional well-being instead of just the logistics of custody modification. David, can I ask you something? Sure. Are you okay? I mean, really okay? This is a lot to handle all at once. He looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if he hadn't expected concern from me given everything that had happened. Some days are better than others. I'm seeing a financial counselor, trying to figure out how to rebuild. And I'm talking to someone, a therapist, about the stress and the depression that came with all of this. Depression. Another word David had never used during our marriage, when his response to emotional difficulties had been to work longer hours or focus on practical solutions. That's good. The kids need you to be healthy, whatever else is happening. Yeah, I'm starting to understand that. As we prepared to leave, David reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. Diana, thank you for handling this conversation so well. I was expecting you to be angry, or to use this situation against me somehow. The comment revealed how much our relationship had been damaged by the divorce process and its aftermath, that he'd expected vindictiveness rather than cooperation. The kids love you, I said simply. That's reason enough to want you to be okay. Driving home that evening, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with apprehension. The truth about David and Vanessa's situation was finally out in the open, which meant I could stop speculating and start planning for the new reality. But it also meant accepting that my life was about to change again, in ways that would require flexibility, strength, and resources I wasn't sure I possessed. At home, Ethan and Grace were waiting for me with questions about their dad's visit and plans for the weekend. I looked at their trusting faces and felt the familiar rush of love and determination that had carried me through every difficult moment since the divorce. Whatever came next, we would handle it together, as a family. And maybe, finally, without the toxic presence of someone who had spent months trying to make me feel small and inadequate. The woman who had mocked my secondhand clothes and modest lifestyle was about to discover what real financial hardship looked like. But instead of feeling vindicated, I found myself hoping that she would find her way to something more authentic and sustainable than the performance she'd been maintaining at my expense. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, with integrity and grace, while others create their own consequences through choices you never would have made. The next phase of my life was beginning, and this time, I was ready for whatever challenges it might bring. 2 weeks after my conversation with David, I found myself facing a decision that would define how I wanted to handle this new chapter of my life. The kids had adjusted to the modified custody arrangement better than I'd expected, though Grace occasionally asked when they'd see their dad's big house again, and Ethan wondered aloud why Vanessa had stopped coming to school events. I was walking through the produce section at Whole Foods, calculating whether I could afford organic apples this week, when I heard a familiar voice from the next aisle over. The conversation was muffled by the display of seasonal squash between us, but the tone was unmistakably distressed. "Mom, I can't keep borrowing money from you and Dad. This is supposed to be temporary, but I don't see how anything's going to get better anytime soon." Vanessa's voice, stripped of its usual confident projection, sounded younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever heard it. I found myself frozen between the Gala and Honeycrisp apples, unintentionally eavesdropping on what was clearly a private phone conversation. I know I said David would take care of everything, but it turns out he couldn't even take care of himself. The house, the cars, the credit cards, all of it was just borrowed money. I had no idea how bad things really were. I should have walked away. The ethical thing would have been to move to a different section of the store and give Vanessa privacy for what was obviously a difficult conversation with her mother. But something kept me rooted in place, listening to the pain in her voice as she described a reality that was completely different from the image she'd projected for months. "No, I can't go back to him. Even if he gets his finances sorted out, I realized that I don't actually know who he is when things get difficult. And I don't like who I became when I was with him." This last statement hit me with unexpected force. During the months of public humiliation at school pickup, I'd assumed that Vanessa's cruelty was simply her personality, a fundamental character flaw that made her enjoy diminishing other people. But what if it had been something else entirely? What if she'd been performing a version of herself that she thought David expected? Or that she thought would make her feel more secure in a relationship that was already unstable? "I know I made mistakes, Mom. I said things to people that I shouldn't have said, and I acted like someone I don't really want to be. I was so scared of losing what I thought I had that I turned into someone mean and petty." The self-awareness in her admission was striking. This wasn't the confident, dismissive woman who'd mocked my coffee-stained blazer and second-hand car. This was someone who'd been forced to confront the gap between the life she'd been pretending to live and the reality she was now facing. I finally managed to unstick my feet and move toward the checkout area, but Vanessa's words stayed with me as I drove home. The image of her I'd been carrying, the caricature of the evil stepmother figure, was suddenly more complicated. She was still someone who'd caused me pain and embarrassment, but she was also someone who'd been living in fear and insecurity, making choices from a place of desperation rather than malice. That evening, after Ethan and Grace were asleep, I found myself thinking about grace and forgiveness, concepts that felt both aspirational and impossible in equal measure. I'd spent months feeling victimized by Vanessa's behavior, building up resentment that had occasionally kept me awake at night, rehearsing clever comebacks I wished I'd thought of in the moment. But sitting in my quiet kitchen, reviewing the day's events and my accidental insight into Vanessa's private struggles, I realized that carrying that resentment was exhausting. It wasn't protecting me or helping my children or contributing anything positive to my life. It was just dead weight, emotional baggage that served no purpose except to keep me focused on past hurts instead of future possibilities. The next morning brought an unexpected test of this new perspective. I was dropping Ethan off at soccer practice when I saw Vanessa's white Range Rover in the parking lot. For a moment, I considered waiting in my car until she left, avoiding the awkward encounter that seemed inevitable. But then I remembered her phone conversation from the grocery store, and something made me decide to approach the situation differently. Vanessa was sitting in her car with the engine running, talking on her phone again. When she saw me walking across the parking lot, she quickly ended her call and got out to meet me halfway. She looked tired in a way that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide, and her usual designer outfit had been replaced with jeans and a simple sweater that made her seem more approachable, more human. "Diana," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Ethan has practice," I replied. Are you picking someone up? No, I was just… She paused, seeming to struggle with how to explain her presence. I was meeting David to return some things, tools and kitchen stuff that belonged to him. The awkwardness of the situation was palpable. But instead of walking away or making polite small talk, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. Vanessa, can I ask you something? She looked surprised but nodded. Are you okay? I mean, with everything that's been happening, are you doing all right? The question clearly caught her off guard. Her carefully composed expression cracked slightly, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. I'm managing, she said quietly. It's been a difficult transition. Transition. Such a careful euphemistic word for having your entire life collapse around you. If you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands what it's like to start over after a relationship ends, I'm around. Vanessa stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Why would you offer that? After how I treated you. This was the opening I'd been unconsciously hoping for, the acknowledgement that her behavior had been inappropriate and hurtful. But now that it was here, I found that I didn't want an apology as much as I wanted to move past the whole dynamic that had defined our interactions for so long. Because we're both just trying to figure out how to navigate complicated situations and do right by the kids we care about, I said. And because holding grudges takes too much energy that I'd rather spend on other things. We stood there in the soccer field parking lot, two women who'd been cast as adversaries in a drama that had ultimately served neither of us well. The October morning was crisp and bright, with the kind of clear sky that made Portland feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Diana, I owe you an apology, Vanessa said finally. Multiple apologies, actually. I said things and did things that were cruel and unnecessary, and I know that my behavior affected you, and possibly the children too. The apology I'd been waiting for was finally happening, but it felt different than I'd imagined it would. Less triumphant, more sad for the time and emotional energy we'd both wasted on a conflict that had never needed to exist. I was scared, she continued. Scared that David would realize I wasn't as smart or capable as he'd thought when we first got together. Scared that you were this amazing mother and ex-wife who made me look inadequate by comparison. Scared that everything I thought I wanted would disappear if I let my guard down for even a second. The honesty was raw and uncomfortable, but also illuminating. All those months of feeling diminished and attacked, and it turned out that Vanessa had been operating from her own sense of inadequacy and fear. I made you into a threat when you were never actually threatening me, she said. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for the comments about your job and your car and your clothes. I'm sorry for trying to make you feel small so that I could feel bigger. I took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside my chest. The resentment I'd been carrying, the anger that had become such a familiar companion, was loosening its grip. Thank you for saying that, I said. It means more than you probably realize. I don't expect forgiveness, Vanessa added quickly. I just wanted you to know that I recognize how wrong I was, and that none of it was really about you. It was about my own insecurities and fears. Forgiveness. The word hung in the air between us, loaded with complexity and possibility. I thought about the months of hurt feelings, the nights I'd lain awake replaying her comments and wishing I'd responded differently. I thought about Grace's perceptive questions, about why some adults say things that sound nice but feel mean. I thought about the energy I'd spent feeling victimized and defensive. Vanessa, I appreciate your apology, I said slowly. And I think maybe we both learned some things about ourselves through this whole experience that we needed to learn. She looked at me with something that might have been hope. What do you mean? I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was, that I can handle difficult people and situations without losing my sense of who I am. And maybe you learned something about the difference between projecting confidence and actually feeling secure. We talked for another 15 minutes, standing in that parking lot while kids ran around the soccer field behind us. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was real in a way that none of our previous interactions had been. Vanessa told me about her plans to move back to Seattle, where her family lived, and to finish the degree in early childhood education that she'd abandoned when she met David. I told her about my expanded role at the nonprofit and the challenges of managing full-time custody while advancing my career. When we finally parted ways, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd gotten an apology, though that certainly helped, but because I'd chosen to respond to someone's vulnerability with compassion rather than defensiveness. I'd broken a cycle of conflict that had been serving no one, and I'd done it in a way that honored both my own dignity and Vanessa's humanity. That afternoon, I was having lunch with my friend Rachel when she asked me how I was handling the changes in my custody arrangement. "It's been an adjustment," I said honestly. "More complicated logistically, but also simpler in some ways. Less drama, less conflict, more focus on just being a family." "And how are you dealing with the whole situation with David's girlfriend?" "I always wondered how you stayed so calm when she was being so obviously nasty to you." I considered how to answer this question, how to explain the shift in my perspective without seeming sanctimonious or naive. "I think she was going through something difficult and handled it badly," I said finally. "We all have moments when we're not our best selves. The difference is whether we recognize it and try to do better." Rachel looked skeptical. "That's very generous of you, Diana. I'm not sure I would be so understanding if someone had treated me the way she treated you." "A year ago, I wouldn't have been either," I admitted. "But I've learned that holding on to anger and resentment takes so much emotional energy. Energy that I'd rather spend on my kids, my work, building something positive, instead of just reacting to something negative." That evening, as I was helping Grace with her art project and supervising Ethan's math homework, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with external validation or vindication. It was the satisfaction of knowing that I'd chosen to respond to a difficult situation with integrity, that I'd modeled for my children what it looks like to handle conflict with grace and maturity. Grace looked up from her watercolor painting, a vibrant scene of our back garden in full bloom. "Mom, you seem happier lately. Do I?" "Yeah. Like you're not worried about grown-up stuff all the time." Ethan glanced up from his multiplication tables. "You smile more now. And you don't get that tense look when Dad comes to pick us up." The perceptiveness of children never ceased to amaze me. They'd noticed changes in my demeanor that I hadn't even been fully aware of myself. The decision to release my resentment toward Vanessa, to choose understanding over anger, had apparently freed up emotional space for more positive feelings. Sometimes when we stop focusing on things that make us upset, we have more energy for things that make us happy, I explained. "Like when I stopped being mad at Jeremy for breaking my crayon and started playing with other kids instead?" Grace asked. "Exactly like that." Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking less and less about the months of public humiliation I'd endured. Not because I'd forgotten or minimized what had happened, but because it no longer felt like the defining feature of my post-divorce experience. Instead of being someone who'd been victimized and had to recover from that victimization, I was simply someone who'd navigated a difficult period with resilience and grace. The change was subtle but profound. I stood straighter in the school pickup line, not because I was preparing for conflict, but because I felt secure in who I was and what I brought to my children's lives. I engaged more confidently with other parents, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I was no longer carrying the defensive posture that had become my default response to social situations. My work at the nonprofit began to reflect this internal shift as well. In meetings with potential funders and community partners, I spoke with an authority and conviction that came from deep self-knowledge rather than external validation. The program I developed for supporting families in crisis was gaining recognition throughout the Portland area, and I was being invited to present at conferences and training sessions. Dr. Williams, my supervisor, called me into her office one Tuesday morning with news that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. "Diana, I've been reviewing your performance metrics and the feedback from the families you work with," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. "The results are exceptional. More than exceptional, actually." I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the remnant of months of feeling constantly evaluated and found wanting. "The board has been discussing the need for a regional coordinator position, someone who could oversee family support programs in multiple counties and help other nonprofits develop similar initiatives. The salary would be significant, probably 40% more than your current position, and there would be opportunities for professional development and conference travel." A 40% salary increase would mean financial security for my family in ways I hadn't experienced since the divorce. It would mean college savings for Ethan and Grace, a more reliable car, maybe even the possibility of buying a house instead of renting. Diana, I'd like to offer you that position. The promotion felt like validation of everything I'd been working toward, but it also felt like something more fundamental. Recognition that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's opinions or approval. I'd been valuable all along, even during the months when Vanessa's comments had made me question my competence and contributions. That evening, I celebrated with Ethan and Grace by taking them out for dinner at their favorite restaurant, a family-owned Italian place, where the servers knew their names and always brought extra breadsticks. As we sat in our familiar booth, sharing stories about our day and making plans for the weekend, I felt a deep contentment that had been absent from my life for longer than I cared to admit. "Mom, why are we celebrating?" Grace asked, twirling spaghetti around her fork with the intense concentration of an 8-year-old. "Because sometimes good things happen when you work hard and treat people with kindness," I said. "And because I got some really good news at work today." "What kind of good news?" Ethan wanted to know. I explained about the promotion in terms they could understand, focusing on what it would mean for our family, rather than the professional recognition it represented. "Does this mean we can get a dog?" Grace asked hopefully. "Let's see how the new job goes first," I said, laughing at her immediate practical application of increased income. As we drove home through the Portland evening, the city lights reflecting off the river and the mountains visible in the distance, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed over the past year. Not just the external circumstances, though those had certainly shifted, but something more fundamental about how I saw myself and my place in the world. The woman who'd felt diminished and defensive in the face of Vanessa's public cruelty was gone. In her place was someone who understood that other people's opinions, especially cruel ones, said more about them than they did about me. Someone who could respond to hostility with grace, to insecurity with compassion, to conflict with wisdom, rather than reactivity. The children were chattering in the back seat about their plans for the evening. Homework and baths and bedtime stories. The comfortable routine of family life that had become our anchor through all the changes and challenges. Their voices filled the car with warmth and laughter, reminding me that the most important audience for my life was sitting right behind me, and they had never doubted my worth or value, even when I'd doubted it myself. The reckoning I'd been unconsciously waiting for had happened, but it hadn't looked like the dramatic confrontation or public vindication I'd sometimes fantasized about. Instead, it had been quiet and internal, a decision to choose understanding over anger, growth over resentment, dignity over defensiveness. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't retaliation or revenge, but simply refusing to let it define you or diminish your capacity for compassion. Sometimes the best victory is discovering that you never needed to defeat anyone in order to succeed. 6 months into my new position as regional coordinator, I had settled into a rhythm that felt both challenging and sustainable. The increased salary had allowed me to move Ethan and Grace into a larger rental house with a proper yard and bedrooms for each of them. More importantly, it had given me a sense of financial security I hadn't experienced since before my divorce. My days were filled with meaningful work, traveling between nonprofit organizations across 3 counties, helping them develop comprehensive family support programs. The work required skills I'd been developing for years: project management, community outreach, grant writing. But it also demanded a level of leadership and strategic thinking that pushed me to grow in ways I hadn't expected. The morning that would change everything started like any other. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on the door with an expression that immediately put me on alert. "Diana, there's someone here to see you. She says it's personal, not work-related." Through the glass window of my office, I could see a woman sitting in our small waiting area, her back turned to me. Something about her posture seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it until she turned around. Vanessa looked different than she had 6 months earlier in the soccer field parking lot. Her hair was shorter, more practical, and she was wearing clothes that suggested a lifestyle change from designer labels to department store practicality. But what struck me most was the sense of purpose in her demeanor. a groundedness that had been absent during all our previous encounters. "Diana, thank you for seeing me," she said as she entered my office. "I know showing up unannounced is presumptuous, but I have something I need to discuss with you." I gestured for her to take a seat, curiosity overriding any lingering discomfort about our complicated history. "I'm moving back to Portland," she said, without preamble. "I've been accepted to Portland State's graduate program in early childhood education, and I start classes in the fall." This was unexpected news. The last I'd heard, through brief updates from David during our custody exchanges, Vanessa had been living with her parents in Seattle and working at a daycare center while figuring out her next steps. "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "You mentioned wanting to finish your degree when we talked before." "I did, and that conversation with you was actually one of the things that motivated me to follow through on the application. But that's not why I'm here." Vanessa shifted in her chair, clearly working up to something difficult. "I've been thinking a lot about the impact of my behavior during those months when I was with David. Not just on you, though that's been weighing on me, but on Ethan and Grace. On what they witnessed and learned from watching how I treated their mother." This was territory I hadn't expected to navigate today. The children had adjusted well to the changes in their custody arrangement, and while they occasionally asked about Vanessa, they seemed to have processed her absence from their lives without significant trauma. "Vanessa, the kids are doing fine. They're resilient, and they understand that adult relationships sometimes don't work out. That's generous of you to say, but I know they saw me being cruel to you. Grace especially. She's so observant and sensitive. I worry that my behavior taught them that it's acceptable for adults to treat each other with disrespect, especially women treating other women badly." The insight was more sophisticated than I would have expected from someone who'd spent months engaging in exactly that kind of behavior. But people could change, could develop self-awareness and emotional intelligence even after making significant mistakes. "What are you hoping to accomplish by coming here?" I asked gently. "I want to make amends. Not just to you, though that's important, but to them. I want to find a way to repair any damage I might have caused to their understanding of how adults should treat each other." This was a level of accountability that went far beyond the apology she'd offered months earlier. This was someone who'd clearly spent considerable time reflecting on the broader implications of her actions. "Vanessa, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but any interaction with the children would need to go through David. And honestly, I'm not sure it's necessary or beneficial for them to revisit that period of their lives. I understand that, and I respect your judgment about what's best for them. But Diana, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that might change how you think about my motivations during that time." She took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself for a difficult revelation. "David told me things about you that weren't true. He said that you were manipulative, that you'd tried to turn the children against him, that you were using them as weapons in the divorce. He painted a picture of you as someone who was vindictive and unstable." The words hit me like ice water. During all those months of enduring Vanessa's public cruelty, I'd assumed her behavior stemmed from simple meanness or insecurity. The possibility that David had been actively poisoning her perception of me had never occurred to me. "I believed him," Vanessa continued, "because I wanted to believe that there was a good reason for him to have left his marriage, that he was the victim rather than someone who'd simply decided he wanted something different. It was easier to make you into the villain than to accept that the man I was with was capable of abandoning his family for selfish reasons." This revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about the dynamics that had shaped the past year of my life. David, who'd always presented himself as straightforward and honest, had been manipulating Vanessa's perception of me in ways that had contributed to her hostility. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I realized that I was never really angry at you. I was angry at the situation, at feeling insecure in a relationship that was built on lies, at being with someone who would speak badly about the mother of his children. But instead of recognizing that my real problem was with David, I took it out on you. The complexity of the situation was almost overwhelming. I'd spent months thinking I was dealing with a straightforward case of someone being needlessly cruel, but the reality was far more complicated. David, Vanessa, and I had all been caught in a web of deception and misdirected emotions that had served no one well. "Vanessa, what David told you about me, none of it was true." I never tried to turn the children against him, and I never used them as weapons. I was trying to protect them from the conflict, not create more of it. I know that now. I could see it in how they talked about you, how secure and happy they were when they came back from your house. Children can't fake that kind of contentment. And I could see it in how you handled my behavior, with more grace than I deserved. We sat in my office for another hour, talking through the layers of misunderstanding and manipulation that had shaped our interactions. Vanessa told me about the gradual realization that David's version of events didn't match the evidence she was seeing with her own eyes. I told her about the confusion and hurt of being treated as an enemy by someone I'd never done anything to harm. Diana, there's one more thing I need to ask you, and please feel free to say no. I'm going to be in Portland for the next 2 years finishing my degree. I don't expect to have a relationship with Ethan and Grace, but if there's ever a situation where you think it would be helpful for them to hear from me directly about any of this, I'm willing to do that. The offer was unexpected and touched me in ways I hadn't anticipated. This was someone who'd caused me significant pain, taking responsibility not just for her own actions, but for their potential long-term impact on my children. I'll keep that in mind, I said. But Vanessa, I want you to know that I think what you're doing, going back to school, building a career that's meaningful to you, that's exactly the right path forward. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, processing everything she'd told me. The revelation about David's role in shaping her hostility toward me was particularly troubling, not because it changed my current situation, but because it revealed a side of my ex-husband that I'd never fully recognized. That evening, as I helped Ethan with his science project and listened to Grace practice piano, I found myself looking at them with fresh eyes. These children had navigated their parents' divorce and its aftermath with remarkable resilience, but they'd also been exposed to adult conflicts and deceptions that no child should have to witness. "Mom, you look worried again," Grace observed during dinner. "Is everything okay?" Her perceptiveness, which I usually appreciated, felt almost overwhelming in this moment. How could I explain that I was processing new information about the adults in her life? Information that revealed layers of deception and manipulation she shouldn't have to understand. "Sometimes grown-up situations are more complicated than they first appear," I said carefully. "But nothing that affects our family or changes how much I love you. Is it about Daddy?" Ethan asked with the direct approach that was characteristic of his 10-year-old perspective on the world. "It's about understanding some things that happened in the past," I said. "But the most important thing is that we're all doing well now, and we're going to keep being a strong family together." Over the following weeks, I found myself reevaluating many of my assumptions about the past year. The narrative I'd constructed, in which I was the victim of Vanessa's unprovoked cruelty, was more complicated than I'd realized. While her behavior had still been inappropriate and hurtful, understanding her motivations helped me process the experience with less personal pain. More troubling was the recognition that David had been willing to misrepresent me to his new partner in ways that had directly contributed to the hostility I'd experienced. This wasn't just about protecting his own image or justifying his choices. It was about actively undermining my relationships with people who were going to be part of my children's lives. I scheduled a conversation with my attorney, Patricia Wells, to discuss whether this new information had any implications for our custody arrangement or support agreements. "Diana, what you're describing is unfortunately more common than most people realize," Patricia said after I had explained Vanessa's revelations. "One parent bad-mouthing the other to their new partners, friends, or family members is a form of emotional manipulation that can have serious consequences for everyone involved. Does it change anything legally? Probably not, unless you can demonstrate that it's having a negative impact on the children's well-being, but it's definitely something to document and monitor. If David is willing to manipulate one person's perception of you, he might do it again." The conversation with Patricia helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just personal drama between adults who didn't get along. It was part of a pattern of behavior that could potentially affect my children's relationships and emotional development. That weekend, I made a decision that felt both necessary and uncomfortable. I called David and asked if we could have a conversation about co-parenting, just the two of us. "Is everything okay with the kids?" he asked immediately. "The kids are fine. But there are some things we need to discuss about how we communicate about each other to the people in our lives." We met at the same cafe where we'd had our conversation about his financial difficulties, but this time the dynamic felt completely different. I wasn't the understanding ex-wife trying to accommodate his problems. I was a parent protecting my children's interests and my own integrity. David, I had a conversation with Vanessa recently. She told me about some of the things you said about me while you were together, about how you characterized our marriage and divorce. His expression shifted immediately. The careful neutrality he'd maintained during our recent interactions replaced by something that looked like guilt, mixed with defensiveness. Diana, whatever she told you, you have to understand that I was going through a difficult time. The end of our marriage, starting a new relationship, all the stress and changes. So you told her that I was manipulative and that I tried to turn the children against you? The directness of my question seemed to catch him off guard. During our marriage, I'd rarely confronted him so bluntly about anything, preferring to avoid conflict even when I disagreed with his choices or behavior. I might have said things that I regret now. When relationships end badly, people sometimes say things they don't really mean. Our relationship didn't end badly, David. You decided you wanted something different, and I accepted that decision with as much grace as I could manage. But apparently you needed to create a narrative where I was the villain in order to justify your choices to yourself and to Vanessa. This conversation was unlike any we'd had during our marriage or since our divorce. I was speaking from a place of clarity and strength rather than hurt or anger, and it was clear that David wasn't sure how to respond to this version of me. Diana, I'm sorry if anything I said contributed to tensions between you and Vanessa. That wasn't my intention. Your intention isn't what matters here. What matters is that your words contributed to a situation where your children watched their father's girlfriend treat their mother with public disrespect. What matters is that Ethan and Grace were exposed to adult conflict that could have been avoided if you'd been honest about why our marriage ended. The weight of this realization seemed to settle on David's shoulders as we talked. He'd created a web of deception that had harmed multiple people, including his own children, all in service of a narrative that made him feel better about his choices. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. I want you to commit to being honest about me and our relationship going forward. If you start dating someone new, if you get remarried, if the kids have questions about why we divorced, I want them to hear the truth, rather than a version of events that makes me into someone I'm not. And what is the truth? The question was so loaded with possibility and pain that I had to take a moment to formulate an answer that was both honest and appropriate for this conversation. The truth is that we were married for 12 years, that we had 2 beautiful children together, that we grew in different directions as people, and that you decided you wanted to pursue a different kind of life. The truth is that I was never vindictive or manipulative, and you were never a victim of my behavior. David nodded slowly, and for the first time since our divorce, I saw something like genuine remorse in his expression. Diana, you're right. I'm sorry for how I handled things, for the stories I told, for not protecting you and the kids from unnecessary conflict. The apology felt different than Vanessa's had, less raw but more significant, because of David's central role in our family's story. This was the father of my children, acknowledging that he'd made choices that had hurt people he claimed to love. I appreciate that, I said. And I hope it means that going forward we can co-parent from a place of honesty and mutual respect. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since those first humiliating encounters at school pickup. The woman who'd felt diminished and defensive in the face of public cruelty had become someone capable of having difficult conversations with clarity and strength. The victim of someone else's hostility had transformed into an advocate for her own integrity and her children's well-being. The journey hadn't been about getting revenge or proving anyone wrong. It had been about understanding the complexity of human motivation, choosing compassion over bitterness, and building a life that reflected my values, rather than simply reacting to other people's choices. At home, Ethan and Grace were building an elaborate fort in the living room, using furniture and blankets to create a magical space where they could read and play games. Their laughter filled the house with warmth and joy, reminding me of what really mattered in all of this. Mom, want to see our secret hideout? Grace called out as I walked through the door. I spent the next hour crawling around their fort, reading stories by flashlight, and listening to their plans for expanding their creation. These were the moments that made everything else worthwhile. The simple pleasure of being present with my children, watching their creativity and joy unfold in the safety of our home. The challenges of the past year had been real and painful, but they'd also been transformative. I'd learned that I was capable of handling far more adversity than I'd ever imagined, that I could choose grace over resentment, and that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's opinions or approval. More importantly, I'd learned that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so authentic and fulfilling that other people's attempts to diminish you become irrelevant. It's raising children who understand that strength comes from kindness, not cruelty, and that real confidence doesn't require making others feel small. As I tucked Ethan and Grace into their beds that night, listening to their prayers and their plans for tomorrow, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with external validation. This was success. 2 happy, secure children, meaningful work that made a difference in the world, relationships built on honesty and mutual respect, and the knowledge that I'd navigated a difficult period of my life with integrity intact. The woman who'd felt victimized by Vanessa's cruelty was gone, replaced by someone who understood that other people's behavior revealed far more about them than it did about me. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise, unmarked by the resentment and defensiveness that had once threatened to define my post-divorce identity. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, I would meet them as I'd learned to meet everything else, with clarity, compassion, and an unshakable knowledge of my own worth. 1 year after my conversation with David about his deception, I received an invitation that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness, growth, and the complexity of human relationships. It arrived on elegant cardstock, the kind of invitation that immediately suggests a significant life event. The return address was familiar: Vanessa Chen. Inside, written in careful calligraphy, was an invitation to her graduation from Portland State University, with her master's degree in early childhood education. At the bottom, in her own handwriting, was a personal note. "Diana, I know this might seem strange, but your encouragement meant more to me than you probably realize. I would be honored if you could attend." I stared at the invitation for several minutes, trying to process the emotions it stirred up. Pride for Vanessa's achievement, uncertainty about whether attending would be appropriate, and something deeper, a recognition of how far we'd all traveled from those painful days at school pickup. Ethan and Grace were now 11 and 9, settled into a rhythm of spending alternate weekends with their father in his modest downtown apartment. David had slowly rebuilt his financial stability, though he lived much more modestly than during his marriage to me or his relationship with Vanessa. The children seemed to have processed the changes in their family structure, with the resilience that continued to amaze me. "Mom, who's that from?" Grace asked, looking up from her homework at the kitchen table. She'd inherited my curiosity about correspondence, always interested in who was writing to whom about what. "It's from Vanessa," I said, deciding that honesty was still the best approach with my children. "She's graduating from college, and she invited me to the ceremony." "Vanessa, who used to live with Daddy?" Ethan asked, his tone matter-of-fact rather than emotional. Time and new experiences had given both children perspective on that period of their lives. "Yes, that Vanessa. She went back to school to become a teacher." Grace looked thoughtful, the way she always did when processing information about the adults in her life. "Are you going to go?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Attending would mean acknowledging publicly that I'd moved beyond whatever hurt or resentment I'd once carried about Vanessa's treatment of me. It would mean celebrating someone who'd caused me pain, but who'd also demonstrated the capacity for growth and genuine remorse. "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "What do you think I should do?" This wasn't a decision I would normally involve my children in, but their input mattered to me, especially since they'd witnessed the conflict between Vanessa and me during some of their most formative years. "I think you should go," Grace said without hesitation. "Remember when you told me that people can learn to be better than they used to be? Maybe this is one of those times." Ethan nodded in agreement. "And besides, if she's going to be a teacher, that's good. Teachers should be nice to people." The wisdom of children never ceased to surprise me. Their ability to see situations without the emotional baggage that complicated adult perspectives often led them to conclusions that were both simpler and more profound than anything I could reach through careful analysis. That evening, I called my friend Sarah to discuss the invitation and my conflicted feelings about attending. "Diana, this might be the most interesting test of personal growth I've ever heard of," she said after I'd explained the situation. "6 months ago, would you have even considered going?" She was right. 6 months earlier, the idea of celebrating Vanessa's achievements would have felt impossible, even masochistic. But something had shifted in my understanding of forgiveness and healing. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, or pretending it hadn't mattered. It was about recognizing that people were capable of genuine change, and that holding space for that change was ultimately more liberating than clinging to old hurts. "I think I want to go," I said slowly, "not because I owe her anything, but because I want to be the kind of person who can celebrate growth and redemption, even in complicated circumstances." "That's very evolved of you. Are you sure you're not just being a martyr?" Sarah's directness was one of the things I valued most about our friendship. She had no interest in enabling self-destructive behavior, even when it was disguised as virtue. "I don't think so. This feels different. It feels like closure in a way that's healthy, rather than self-punishing." The graduation ceremony was held on a beautiful May afternoon in Portland State's campus amphitheater. I arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly from genuine curiosity about how this event would unfold. The amphitheater was filled with proud families, flowers, and the excited energy that accompanies major life milestones. I found a seat in the middle section, close enough to show support but not so prominent as to make Vanessa uncomfortable if she changed her mind about wanting me there. As I watched the graduates file in, I spotted her immediately. She looked confident and purposeful in her cap and gown, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who'd worked hard for something meaningful. When her name was called, Vanessa Chen, Master of Arts in Early Childhood Education, magna cum laude, I found myself genuinely moved by her achievement. This was someone who'd faced the collapse of her carefully constructed life, and had chosen education, growth, and service to others as her path forward. After the ceremony, I was making my way toward the exit when I heard my name called. Vanessa was walking toward me, still in her cap and gown, accompanied by an older couple who were clearly her parents. "Diana, you came," she said, and I could hear both surprise and gratitude in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "Congratulations," I said, and meant it completely. "This is a significant achievement." She introduced me to her parents as a friend who encouraged me during a difficult transition, which struck me as both accurate and diplomatically phrased. Her mother, a small woman with Vanessa's dark eyes and direct manner, thanked me for my support of her daughter's education. "Vanessa has told us about your work with families in crisis," her father said. "It sounds like meaningful work." We talked for a few minutes about my role at the nonprofit, about Portland's educational landscape, about the challenges and rewards of working with children and families. It was the kind of conversation I might have had with any parent at any graduation ceremony, normal and pleasant and completely divorced from our complicated history. "Diana, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Vanessa asked as her parents moved toward the reception area. We walked to a quieter section of the campus, away from the crowds of celebrating families. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, creating a peaceful atmosphere that felt appropriate for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I have something I want to tell you," Vanessa began, "about why your presence here today means so much to me." I waited, curious about what she wanted to share. When I was at my lowest point, living with my parents and working at that daycare center, feeling like I'd completely failed at being an adult, I kept thinking about our conversation in the soccer field parking lot, about how you responded to my apology with such grace, and how you offered to help me find work even though I'd treated you terribly. She paused, looking out across the campus where students and families were still celebrating. "I realized that you were modeling something I'd never learned how to do, how to respond to conflict and hurt with dignity instead of defensiveness. How to choose understanding over anger, even when anger would have been completely justified." This was not the conversation I'd expected to have at a graduation ceremony, The depth of reflection in her words suggested months or even years of processing our interactions and their broader implications. "I don't think I'm as gracious as you're making me sound," I said honestly. "I was angry for a long time. I just eventually realized that the anger was hurting me more than it was accomplishing anything productive. But that's exactly what I mean. You found a way to move through the anger to something healthier, something that allowed for growth and change. I never learned how to do that before." We talked for another 20 minutes, standing under the trees on that beautiful spring afternoon. Vanessa told me about her work with preschoolers, about discovering that she had a natural gift for helping anxious children feel secure, about her plans to eventually open her own early childhood center focused on social-emotional learning. "I want to create an environment where children learn how to handle conflict and disappointment in healthy ways," she said, "where they see adults modeling the kind of behavior I wish I'd learned when I was young." The conversation felt like the closing of a circle that had begun with cruelty and misunderstanding, but was ending with genuine growth and mutual respect. Not friendship exactly, but something deeper, recognition of each other's humanity and capacity for change. As we prepared to part ways, Vanessa made one final request. "Diana, would it be possible for me to write letters to Ethan and Grace? Not to have a relationship with them, I understand that ship has sailed, but to acknowledge my role in creating conflict during a difficult time in their lives, and to let them know that I've learned from those mistakes." The request was unexpected and required careful consideration. My children were doing well, secure in their family relationships and not particularly concerned about the past. But they were also at ages where they could understand concepts like accountability, growth, and redemption. "Let me think about it," I said. "If I decide it would be beneficial for them, I'll let you know." "Of course. And Diana, thank you again for being here today. It meant more than you can possibly know." Driving home through the Portland afternoon, I reflected on how much had changed since those first painful encounters at school pickup. The woman who'd felt victimized and defensive had become someone capable of celebrating the growth of someone who'd once hurt her. The children who'd witnessed adult conflict had learned lessons about resilience, forgiveness, and the complexity of human relationships that would serve them throughout their lives. That evening, I told Ethan and Grace about the graduation ceremony and Vanessa's request to write them letters. "What would she want to say to us?" Grace asked with the practical curiosity that was characteristic of her approach to complicated situations. "I think she wants to apologize for her behavior during the time when your dad was with her, and to let you know that she's learned from her mistakes." "Would the letters be sad?" Ethan wanted to know. "I don't think so. I think they would be about taking responsibility and about how people can change and grow." Both children thought about this for several minutes, processing the implications with the seriousness they brought to all discussions about family matters. "I think it would be okay," Grace said finally. "Sometimes it's good to know that grown-ups can learn to be better, especially when kids are watching." Ethan nodded in agreement. "And if she's going to be a teacher, maybe other kids will benefit from what she learned about treating people nicely." Their mature perspective on the situation reminded me of how much they'd grown through all the changes and challenges of the past few years. They'd witnessed conflict, disappointment, and transformation, and they'd emerged with emotional intelligence and resilience that would serve them well throughout their lives. Over the following weeks, I gave considerable thought to Vanessa's request and my children's response. Eventually, I decided that allowing her to write age-appropriate letters acknowledging her past behavior and expressing her growth might indeed be beneficial for Ethan and Grace. It would reinforce the lessons they'd already learned about accountability, change, and the importance of treating others with respect. When the letters arrived, they were thoughtful and appropriate, written in language that children could understand, but with genuine emotion and accountability. Vanessa acknowledged that she'd behaved badly toward their mother during a difficult time in her life, expressed regret for any confusion or hurt her actions might have caused them, and shared her hope that they would remember that adults, like children, could learn to make better choices. Grace read her letter twice, then looked up at me with the kind of serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Mom, do you think Vanessa is really sorry, or is she just saying she's sorry?" It was a sophisticated question that revealed Grace's developing understanding of the difference between genuine remorse and performative apology. "I think she's really sorry," I said, Sometimes it takes people a long time to understand the impact of their actions, but when they do understand, they want to make it right. That's good, Grace said simply. It's better when people learn to be nice. That summer brought another unexpected development. David called to tell me that he'd been offered a job in Seattle, a significant promotion with an accounting firm that specialized in nonprofit financial management. It was an opportunity that would allow him to rebuild his career while working in a field that aligned more closely with his values. It would mean seeing the kids less frequently, he said during our conversation about the potential move. Maybe once a month instead of every other weekend. I know that's a big change. The practical implications were significant. Less frequent visits with their father would mean more responsibility for me, but it would also mean more stability and consistency in Ethan and Grace's daily lives. How do you think they'll handle it? I asked. I think they'll be okay. They're settled here with you, in their schools and activities. And honestly, I think the current arrangement has been more about my need to maintain a parental role than about what's actually best for them. This level of self-awareness was new for David, and I respected his willingness to prioritize our children's well-being over his own desire to maintain a specific custody schedule. If you take the job, we can figure out how to make visits work. Maybe longer stays during school breaks, summer visits, that kind of thing. Diana, I want you to know how much I appreciate how you've handled everything over the past few years. The divorce, the financial problems, the whole situation with Vanessa. You've been incredibly gracious through circumstances that would have made a lot of people bitter or vindictive. The acknowledgement was meaningful, but it also felt like something I'd already moved beyond. The woman who'd needed David's approval or appreciation was gone, replaced by someone who derived satisfaction from her own choices and values, rather than external validation. I did what felt right for the kids and for me, I said simply. I know. And that's what makes it so remarkable. When I told Ethan and Grace about their father's potential move to Seattle, their responses reflected the emotional maturity they'd developed through all the changes in their family structure. Will we still see him? Grace asked. Yes, just less frequently. Maybe longer visits, but farther apart. Will you be okay taking care of us by yourself most of the time? Ethan asked with the kind of practical concern that made me proud of his thoughtfulness. I'll be fine. We're a good team, and we've been managing well with our current routine. Both children processed this information with the same calm acceptance they'd shown toward all the other changes in their lives. They trusted that the adults would figure out the logistics and that their fundamental security and happiness would remain intact. David did accept the job in Seattle, and we worked out an arrangement where he would have the children for a week during winter break, 2 weeks in the summer, and 1 long weekend per month. The reduced frequency of transitions actually seemed to benefit everyone, giving Ethan and Grace more consistency in their daily lives and giving me more control over their schedules and activities. As autumn approached, marking 2 full years since those first painful encounters with Vanessa at school pickup, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who'd felt diminished by public cruelty had become someone confident in her own worth and capable of responding to conflict with wisdom rather than reactivity. My work at the nonprofit had continued to expand, with recognition of our family support programs leading to invitations to present at national conferences and consult with organizations in other states. The financial security that came with professional success had allowed me to provide my children with opportunities and experiences that enriched their lives without the constant stress of worrying about money. More importantly, the emotional growth I'd experienced through navigating those difficult months had made me a better mother, a more effective advocate for the families I served, and a more authentic version of myself than I'd ever been before. One evening in late October, almost exactly 2 years after that first humiliating encounter in the school pickup line, I was helping Grace with a social studies project about conflict resolution when she asked me a question that brought everything full circle. Mom, when grown-ups are mean to each other, is it always because they're unhappy about something else? The question revealed the depth of her processing about the adult conflicts she'd witnessed and the lessons she derived from watching how different people handled difficult emotions. Not always, I said carefully. Sometimes people are just thoughtless or selfish. But often, When someone is consistently cruel to others, it's because they're struggling with something painful or difficult in their own life. Like when Vanessa was mean to you because she was scared about her relationship with Daddy. Grace's analysis was remarkably sophisticated for a 9-year-old, demonstrating her ability to understand complex emotional dynamics and human motivation. That's a good example. When people feel insecure or threatened, they sometimes try to make themselves feel better by making others feel worse. But it never actually works, because the real problem is still there. So the better thing to do is to figure out what's really bothering you and try to fix that instead? Exactly. And if you can't fix it, at least you can choose not to make it other people's problem. Grace nodded seriously, filing this information away with the other life lessons she was collecting as she navigated her way toward adolescence and adulthood. That night, after both children were asleep, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and thought about the profound changes that had occurred in our lives over the past 2 years. The challenges had been real and painful, but they'd also been transformative in ways I could never have anticipated. I'd learned that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain or conflict, but about choosing how to respond when difficult situations arose. I discovered that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing harmful behavior, but about releasing the hold that past hurts had on my present happiness. I'd found that true strength came not from defending myself against every slight or insult, but from knowing my own worth so deeply that others' opinions became irrelevant. Most importantly, I'd modeled for my children what it looked like to navigate adversity with integrity, to choose understanding over judgment, and to build a life based on authentic values rather than external validation. The woman who'd once felt victimized by a school pickup encounter had become someone who could celebrate the growth and redemption of the person who'd caused her pain. The mother who'd worried about protecting her children from conflict had raised kids who understood that conflict was part of life, but that how you handled it determined who you became as a person. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a deep satisfaction that came not from vindication or revenge, but from the knowledge that I'd chosen the harder path and emerged from it as a better version of myself. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise, unmarked by resentment or bitterness, guided by the hard-won wisdom that comes from choosing grace over grudges, understanding over anger, and growth over revenge. The reckoning I'd unconsciously sought hadn't come in the form of public vindication or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it had come through the quiet satisfaction of building a life so authentic and fulfilling that past hurts lost their power to define me. It had come through the recognition that the best response to cruelty wasn't cruelty in return, but the kind of strength that transforms both victim and perpetrator through the simple act of refusing to perpetuate cycles of pain. Sometimes the most profound victories are the ones that look like ordinary life lived with extraordinary integrity. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming someone so secure in their own worth that the opinions of those who once sought to diminish them become as irrelevant as yesterday's weather. And sometimes, the most beautiful endings are the ones that don't feel like endings at all, but like the beginning of something richer, deeper, and more meaningful than anything that came before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.